When will we be able to declare victory over U.S. racial history? What is the hill on which we will plant that flag? We started in quite a valley, behind a legacy of oppression and suffering. Slavery pre-existed the country and was continued into it. All men are created equal did not include women, but also did not include all men. Even in the Constitution, in its original text, never changed by amendment, was the concept that people who were in a state of servitude, that is, were slaves in a racial caste system, were 3/5 of a person for representation and were 0/5 of a person for a vote. And even after the freeing of the slaves, the granting of their official right to vote, shortly after the period of Reconstruction was closed, a new era we sometimes call Jim Crow set in. It was an era of racialized violence, of voter suppression, of freedom suppression, of cruelty, of suffering, of limited opportunities. And those who fled to the north, trying to escape the worst of the Jim Crow South, did not find a paradise here either. So when might we have been able to declare victory? In the recent past. We could have said in the 1950s, with the Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, decision ending the segregation of schools, there was a victory. But it was a small one. In the 1960s, the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the flowering of the civil rights movement saw some changes, again, often on paper, not always on the ground. In the 1970s, steps forward were taken in major cities. Mayors were elected who were African American, who represented their population. But often they were elected because the white citizens of the city had fled, what we call today white flight. In the 1980s, there was a major presidential candidate named Jesse Jackson, and yet it was also a period when a law was passed to penalize crack cocaine at 100 times the rate as powder cocaine. Given the racial disparity in the populations that use those two kinds of drugs, the persecution of one was the persecution of a group, not just a crime of commission. So maybe it wasn't so clear then, but maybe, just maybe, by 2008, when this country proved itself able to elect someone who was black, or at least half black, whatever that means, maybe that was a step forward. That was a turning point. Maybe we had gotten beyond that historic problem. But I want to raise for you a challenge. And the challenge is, when is the legacy done? You can change the laws, but when does the legacy work its way through? I'll give you just one example. It's a practice that was called redlining. Redlining meant that you would take a map and draw lines to mark out the areas where it wasn't safe to offer a mortgage or to give car insurance or home insurance. And was that by the credit history of the individual people involved? No. It was often by the ethnic and racial profile of that general neighborhood. And of course, realtors were part of this because they would steer people into those neighborhoods and not allow them to move into other neighborhoods. Now, in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed to try and make this illegal. And again, it was put on the books. But we found in studies ever since, again and again, that even with comparable or higher incomes, black Americans are more likely to get subprime loans, that is, with a higher interest rate, than white Americans. In 2012, Wells Fargo, one of the largest domestic mortgage lenders in the country, settled with the Department of Justice and admitted that over 4,000 African American and Hispanic borrowers who qualified for loans were charged higher fees or higher rates or were improperly placed into subprime loans than non-colored, to use the old terminology, non-people of color applicants for the same loans with the same income, with the same qualifications. And just in 2015, in last May, there was a bank that served Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, had a settlement for hundreds of millions of dollars with the Department of Housing and Urban Development for, again, a case of discriminatory practice and sometimes obnoxious language about the lenders. But even more so, it was again this redlining approach. Even if it's around one person, it still has its impact. In March 2015, Forbes magazine, no bastion of radical racial politics, had an article explaining why the typical white household has 16 times the wealth of a typical black household. As it said in the article, quote, the median white household had $111,000 in wealth holdings in 2011, compared to $7,000 for the median black household and $8,000 for the median Latino household. 16 times more. Why? Well, part of it is the home ownership rate. Given that history of redlining and insurance and not granting mortgages and granting them at higher interest rates, 73% of white families compared to 43% of black families own their homes. And if it's harder to get a mortgage and it's harder to get insurance, guess what the value of the house does? It goes down. And so the value of the asset is lower. When you have limited property values and limited financial security and limited assets, that leads to more limited educational opportunities. It leads to more limited employment opportunities because of the limited educational opportunities. And then there are results that follow from that. The kind of jobs available in those areas don't offer health care benefits, which creates more expense out of pocket and to deal with health care crises. And as one author puts it, you might want to ask why there are so many churches and so few supermarkets in many of these neighborhoods. After all, that limits on loan doesn't only apply to domestic mortgage. It could apply to a business loan. It could apply to a risky venture like a supermarket in this area, while a liquor store, a church, that's feasible. What are the ripple impacts of growing up in a neighborhood like that? What are the legacy impacts of having grown up in a neighborhood like that when it was at its worst in the 60s and the 70s? Do you see a value in going to school? Is it going to get you anywhere? Do you feel like you are part of the American dream? Or even that dream that Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of so eloquently in 1963, which he said was an extension of the American dream? Well, one writer, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who writes for The Atlantic, does not feel like he is part of the American dream and hasn't for many years. He would watch those documentaries on Martin Luther King Day and on Black History Month of people suffering for a good cause and think, are they trying to suffer? What are they trying to do? It didn't get me out of where I am. But he also looked at what he would see on television, what he called the dreamers, the people who are living that American dream that to him is behind a screen. There is the burden of living among the dreamers, he writes, and there is the extra burden of your country telling you the dream is just, noble, and real, and you are crazy for seeing the corruption and smelling the sulfur. For their innocence, they nullify your anger, your fear, until you are coming and going, and you find yourself inveighing against yourself, really inveighing against your own humanity, and raging against the crime in your ghetto, because you are powerless before the great crime of history that brought the ghetto to be. Now, Coates himself, I looked up today, he's only 10 days older than me. He was born on September 30th of 1975. And last year he wrote a searing book called Between the World and Me, drawing on a line from Richard Wright. It's a letter to his 15-year-old son, and he begins the narrative by describing his son's reaction to hearing the verdict in the Mike Brown case, where there were many people who were convinced that Brown was innocent and was targeted by the police. The actual story is more complicated, but at the time it was very emotional. And when the police officer was exonerated and not indicted, his son said, "I gotta go," and went into his room and closed the door. And he knew it was to cry, and he felt terrible. He was sad and fearful for his child. He was sad that his son had been disappointed in the arc of justice bending the wrong way. But there was also in Coates a deep-seated fear for his son's future, and it was a fear that went back to the moment that his son was born. And here's what he writes. At night I held you, and a great fear, wide as all our American generations, took me. Now I personally understood my father and the old mantra, either I can beat him or the police. I understood it all, the wires, the extension cords, the ritual switch. Black people love their children with a kind of obsession. You are all we have, and you have come to us endangered. I think we would like to kill you ourselves before seeing you killed by the streets that America made. That is a philosophy of the disembodied, of a people who control nothing, who can protect nothing, who are made to fear not just the criminals among them, but the police who lord over them with all the moral authority of a protection racket. It was only after you that I understood this love, that I understood the grip of my mother's hand. She knew that the galaxy itself could kill me, that all of me could be shattered, and all of her legacy spilled on the curb like bum wine. And no one would be brought to account for this destruction, because my death would not be the fault of any human, but the fault of some unfortunate but immutable fact of race, imposed upon an innocent country by the inscrutable judgment of invisible gods. The earthquake cannot be subpoenaed. The typhoon will not bend under indictment. Coates tells the story of his upbringing in Baltimore, the disconnect between his urban experience and the world of the American dream that he saw on TV, remembering a show called Mr. Belvedere that I remember from my childhood, of a suburban family with what we would today call a manny, a male nanny, watching the children from England versus their all-American home, and there's 2.2 kids in the yard and everything else. And then he questioned the value of school, the value of striving. What was the point? School wasn't about curiosity, he writes, it was about conformity. It was about fitting the rules, and what good would that do me? And then he found what he calls the Mecca. It wasn't in Saudi Arabia. For Coates, the Mecca was Howard University, the Black Harvard, so to speak. It was there he saw black people from all over the world and all over America, and he was the majority. And they were the establishment. And their studies were the core curriculum. Later in his life, he had eye-opening experiences in New York City with all of its massive diversity, and his experiences in Paris, which changed his perceptions, just as it did for many African Americans who moved to Paris in the 20s and 30s to escape Jim Crow and found an acceptance they could never have found in America. He wants his son's experience to be different. He writes, I don't know what it means to grow up with a black president. Social networks, omnipresent media, and black women everywhere in their natural hair. There's a balance of fear and hope. There's a fear from what he learned growing up. There is a hope that maybe it's different, but then there's the fear that maybe it's not. Today, we do live in a different moment in race relations. If we started as a country at a 0 with slavery at the founding of the country, and a 10 would be ideal, we are not at 0. We are not even at 5. I would say we're over 5, but we're still far from 10. As I was reading Coates' book, it reminded me again and again of Jewish life, just a couple of generations ago. An experience of being unable to protect your children from anti-Semitism or from violence. A fear of the outside society made real and justified by the Holocaust experience. An experience of being a marginalized minority, not respected or understood by the broader culture. The relief of an in-group experience, why affiliation rates were so high, why Jews would choose to move where there were lots of other Jews in neighborhoods and even suburbs moving all together. Now today, American Jews are largely white. We are able to attend just about any university we want, and we are able to be successful there as well. American Jews are twice as likely to be college graduates as the general American population, and they're 3 times as likely to have incomes over $150,000. We've made it. We're white. And now we are even so white that we are sometimes seen as on the other side of the oppressed and the oppressor. And I'll be talking more about this in our program on Sunday morning, discussing Zionism and anti-Zionism. Part of that transition happened after World War II. The war to end racism, to end oppression on racial identity. Of course, black soldiers came back to Jim Crow, but Jewish soldiers came back to a different world. And I'll give you just one example that shows the trauma for the African American community and the opportunity for the Jews. After World War II, a number of planned suburbs developed. The classic model was a place called Levittown, made by Mr. Levitt, one of us, right? Part of the tribe, one would say. Don't worry, it stays on. Levittown was a planned community. It made affordable housing available. There were home loans guaranteed for veterans from the war, as so many thousands and millions of American men were. They were going to college on the GI Bill. But Levittowns were covenanted. That was the fancy language for race restricted. They were whites only, but Jews counted as white. And Coates writes about one example of a Levittown that doesn't even realize what it's saying. In 1957, the white residents of Levittown, Pennsylvania, argued for their right to keep their town segregated. Quote, "As moral, religious, and law-abiding citizens, we feel that we are unprejudiced and undiscriminating in our wish to keep our community a closed community." This, Coates writes, "This was the attempt to commit a shameful act while escaping all sanction, and I raise it to show you there was no golden era when evildoers did their business and loudly proclaimed it as such. There was always an excuse, a reason, a rationale. It was for the good of something. It wasn't bad, but whom did it affect?" As Coates describes it, being white means there is a black. Claiming you're white is a statement of hierarchy rather than a factual description of one's features. As he writes, "The new people were something else before they were white: Catholic, Corsican, Welsh, Mennonite, Jewish. And if all our national hopes have any fulfillment, then they will have to be something else again. Perhaps they will truly become American and create a nobler basis for their myths. I cannot call it. As for now, it must be said that the process of washing the disparate tribes white, the elevation of the belief in being white, was not achieved through wine tastings and ice cream socials, but rather through the pillaging of life, liberty, labor, and land. To make yourself white, it helps to push someone else into black." He mentions a famous episode where Saul Bellow, the American Jewish author, said in a very bombastic pronouncement, as he was wont to do, "Who is the Tolstoy of the Zulus? What has Africa given to world culture?" he says. Who is the Tolstoy of the Zulus? And a later African-American author named Ralph Wiley had a very clever response to this. He said, "Tolstoy is the Tolstoy of the Zulus. Unless you feel the need to break everyone up by their little ethnic groups, in which case you don't belong to Tolstoy's group. Because you're American, because you write in English, because you're of Jewish background. Any number of ways can carve you away from Tolstoy. So if Tolstoy belongs to you, then Tolstoy belongs to humanity." Today, in the challenges we face in racial relations, there are a lot of new issues that have come to the fore. And we don't have a clear path forward on many of them, but it's worth contemplating what we might do. The first one is the challenge of intent versus result. Do you need to demonstrate a clear racist intention, have emails or text messages or other kind of obnoxious material, or is simply having a disparate result enough for an intervention? And this is currently in debate at the Supreme Court again and again. Is it result or is it intention that makes a difference? There was a fascinating article a couple of years ago when the Black Lives Matter movement began that explored the distinction between racism and bias. Can you accept the label of racist? That's hard to do. But can you accept the fact of bias that people make unconscious? You see, racism seems like a conscious, cross-burning, vicious hatred of people. Bias, sure, we have a bias. We have an unconscious, not chosen, I'm even unaware that I've been doing it kind of a tendency. And so here's where, we get the question of intention versus result. The white audience might say, oh, it's just bias. I didn't mean it. And the result would say, but it's a racist result. It privileges one group over another and disadvantages one more than any other. You can think about the famous study done at Northwestern University, where they sent the same resumes with the same degrees from the same universities to the same job applications. Some of them had stereotypically black names, and some of them had stereotypically white names. And the white names were twice as likely to get an interview as the black names with the exact same numbers. Why does that happen? Is it bias? Is it racism? Again, the labels are complicated. But Coates has no patience for intentions. He says, quote, "A good intention is a hall pass through history, a sleeping pill that ensures the dream." I would say intention counts. Results count too. Intention is not zero, but it's not everything either. We can think about the debates surrounding policing. You don't have to go outside of Chicago to talk about debates involving policing in minority communities. You can go back to John Burge and his reign of terror for 20 years, from 1972 to 1991. The way police reports are changed, the way that the police fraternal order has never had a shooting it said was unjustified. Never, never, ever, not once, ever. Unlikely. The reports even more recently of police officers disabling their cameras so they couldn't be caught, resisting microphones. All of these challenges that does not mean that all police officers are either evil or even biased. One African-American police officer, veteran, said that in his experience, it was divided into three pieces. There were maybe 10% who were just bad apples. And there were 10% who would do the right thing no matter what. And the remaining 80% in the middle could be swayed either way. And so the question becomes how to reinforce that good 10% and reinforce that could be good 80% to undermine the will be bad 10%. We hear a lot of times whenever the question of policing is raised, the challenge of black on black crime. And remember what Coates said earlier, you rail against the crime in the ghetto without thinking about the larger crime that made the ghetto be. He talks a lot about how when you're afraid, you strike out, whether it was his father beating him when he was a child, that fear of what might happen outside, or the beating of each other when you try to exert power over someone who has less power than you, precisely because you feel like you have limited power beyond your orbit. But the most important response to the is there black crime that affects black people is yes, and. You can object to both. It's a distraction to say, well, if there's black on black crime, then all the police misconduct is justified. It doesn't work that way. You can be objecting to both. You can be fighting against both. One is not directly related to the other. The big question that comes out whenever anyone uses the phrase from this movement from a couple of years ago and into today, Black Lives Matter, is why don't we believe that all lives matter? Why can't we celebrate all lives and value all lives and preserve all lives? And I saw a very amusing response to this on Twitter, which demands brevity. This person said, I wonder if these people who say all lives matter run through cancer conventions saying all diseases matter. Or run through wards of the hospital, say every ward matters. The reality is that saying Black Lives Matter does not say that Korean lives don't matter or blue lives, police lives don't matter. It's trying to make the emphasis that all too often that is missed. It's undermined. It's not paid attention to more closely. After all, we in the Jewish community spend a lot of time saying Jewish lives matter. We notice when there's a bombing or a stabbing in Israel, when there's a plane crash and someone prominent in the Jewish community is involved, when a famous person dies of Jewish background, we notice that, we mark that, because for us, Jewish lives matter. Well, if we're allowed to notice the Jews, if we're allowed to say that Jewish lives matter, then perhaps that community or others who are sympathetic with that community are allowed to say that black lives matter too. There's a whole new vocabulary of rhetoric. Do you know what microaggressions are? Microaggressions are the little things that just add up and add up and add up. Oh, you're so articulate, as if it's a surprise. Coates' wife heard once, you're really pretty for a dark-skinned girl. It's an attempt to be a compliment, but there's something undermining every time, putting you on the stand to represent your people as if you are the spokesperson. It happens again and again. There's something called tone policing, another one of those distractions. Why do you have to be so angry? Can't you have a reasonable discussion about this topic? And so then you change the topic from what their objection is to the way they're voicing their objection. And it's very easy for the people in power to say, calm down, be patient and wait. There's a beautiful passage in Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail where he says, this is exactly what they've been saying for many decades, calm down, be patient, and then I have to explain to my daughter why Funtown won't let black people in when she sees the ad on TV again and again and again. And I've had enough, and I'm not going to sit and wait. After all, we have to remember that passive resistance or peaceful resistance, nonviolent resistance, was not passive. It caused dislocation, it caused pain, it disrupted lives. That was the point. Sitting quietly doesn't work, and tone policing is another way to tell people, sit quietly, be patient. The concept of safe space, that there are certain places where you can't offer critique, where you can't share your concerns. And most importantly, the one we hear all the time now is, check your privilege. The concept of privilege, that there are certain things that one is open to, that is available to one in their life because of the color of their skin, or their gender, or their socioeconomic standing, or the place where they live. There are assumptions that we make all the time. This is learning your internalized bias, or learning the bias with which other people treat you. Again, it's a new world. We have to think differently about these things, because now, finally, we're learning how to listen. And the last challenge is, what do we mean by opportunity? What do we mean by the American dream? What Coates dismisses as the dreamers, the people who are dreaming, who think this is the way things are. How do we open up that opportunity to people who come from areas that have been redlined for generations, who have not been able to pay for their children's college, or pass down the family home, or transfer wealth from generation to generation because it isn't there? How does one make up for that? Are there restorative actions that need to be done? Are there doors that should be held open a little longer? Are there extra attention that needs to be paid to our own inclinations? As I said at the outset, Coates and I are almost exactly the same age, but our childhood experiences were worlds apart. The balance of hope and fear that we have for ourselves and for our children are very different. Part of moving forward in a challenging relationship is learning how to listen first, how to understand second, analyze third, and then act. Even if we're uncomfortable with some of these perceptions, the experience, the tone, the response to the world that we experience differently, we cannot address the chasm between us until we first hear them and then understand. So I want to close with a poem I wrote a couple of years ago. It was a poem to respond to a poetry contest by a socialist Jewish magazine, so clearly looking to the left. The theme of the contest was the American Dream. And so here is my poem. It's entitled Dumplings and Dreams. Kreplach en a choilem is nit geen kreplach nor a choilem. Dumplings in a dream are not dumplings, but a dream. The American dream is not America, but a dream. Land where my fathers died, not Lithuania, Belarus, Aleppo, Paris, Jerusalem. Real graves are dumplings, the song the dream. We the people, not in a people's history, not powerless people, native people, dark people, women people. Real lives are dumpling, the words the dream. One nation under God, your God, my God, whose God, why God? Why not in good we trust? Doubts are dumplings, the slogan the dream. But dreams mean, said Sigmund Gaon of Vienna. 7 fat dumplings eaten by 7 lean. Not fate may be future, not reality, changing reality. Some say the American dream is Jewish Hollywood dream, safe home, blonde wife, 2.2 kids in 2.2 cars. Some say American dream is American nightmare, built of bodies and blood, screams and silence. Dreams mean. Im tirtzu en zo agada. If you will it, it is no dream. It is no longer only a dream. My fathers died there, but mine will die here, as will my sons. We are the people, a still more perfect union, one nation in diversity, God optional, blended, cross-pollinated, mixed and miscegenated, hybrid vigorous fruits from Jewish roots. Dreams become. Dreams become the possible, then possible becomes present. Kreplach in America are both kreplach and dumplings. The American dream is not America, is America, is a dream, is.